I wasn't thinking at all, and how rude. We have a guest speaker, and nobody said who he was or anything. So I'm here to inform you that we have Eric Borlaug, who used to preach for us, now preaches in some place called Bowling Green or something, Kentucky. So now we get to hear him teach our class and going through a gospel meeting this week. If you're able to be with us, we'll be here today through Wednesday, every night at 7 p.m. except for tonight. Tonight is 5 p.m. So I'm just glad to have you, Eric, and hope you enjoy the Word of God from Eric Borlaug.
Good morning. It's good to be with all of you guys. I invite you to open your Bibles to Ezekiel, and we'll be, depending on how long it takes to get through some of this stuff, we might have some time for some discussion because this is a class period, but we'll see how that works. I just want to say, I'll say more at the 10 a.m. service, but I'm thankful to be back with you guys. Asher was really excited to be able to come on this trip and get reconnected with people, and as we've been driving around, there's been a lot of places that have come back to his memory that he goes, oh yeah, I remember this and that, and so you guys facilitated a lot of good memories for him and for our whole family, and so the rest of our family says hi, and our family has doubled in size since we left here, and so we got 2 other kids that were both born in Georgia, but someday I hope you guys can see all of them. But for now, I'll reserve some more comments for the next service. But it is good to be with all of you. For several years now, and this really started when I was here, the visions of the book of Ezekiel have been something that I've tried to meditate on a lot and think through, and try to understand why they're there, the message of them. And it wasn't too long ago that I realized that all 4... Okay, so let me say this first. In the book of Ezekiel, there's only 4 visions. There's a lot of picturesque things that Ezekiel is told to tell the people, but there's only 4 times where he's explicitly brought into the Spirit, and he sees something. And in these 4 visions, they, in one sense, summarize the whole story of the Bible, when you look at them one after another. I don't know if that's by intent for Ezekiel and the Holy Spirit as they were interacting and all that kind of stuff, or if that's just a helpful way to remember the visions of the book of Ezekiel. But what I want to do with you in this first session is just highlight each of these 4 visions in the book and then show how this says something about the whole Bible story. Before we start looking at these, though, let me just say something about the original audience of this book. Ezekiel was taken into exile or captivity by the Babylonians. There was 3 times, hey Lisa, I haven't said hi to you yet. There's 3 times, and the Kuro family, not Kuros, but yeah, hi. There's 3 times where the Babylonians besieged the southern kingdom, and the first one was when like Daniel was taken, the second one would have been when Ezekiel was taken. And so try to imagine being in exile with Ezekiel. And you're hundreds of miles away from your homeland of Jerusalem, and here's this guy that keeps getting messages or visions from God, and every time he gets a new message or vision, he goes back to the people and he says, all right guys, this is what God says, this is what God says. And everybody's wondering, well, what's going to happen to Jerusalem? Is it going to be like a quick turnaround, like the false prophets were saying in the book of Jeremiah, that everything's going to be good soon? Or what's it going to be? And so Ezekiel would get these visions from God and say, for most of the book, we're all going to be decimated. And then in the second half of the book, he says, but there's going to be this eventual restoration. In these 2 sections of the book, there are 2 visions in the judgment half of Ezekiel, and then there's 2 visions in the restoration half of Ezekiel. Here are the 4 visions. The first one in Ezekiel chapter 1 is the vision of the likeness of the glory of God. The second one is Ezekiel 8 through 11, where you have the abomination of sin that's happening in the temple. The third one is Ezekiel 37, 1 through 14, where it's the valley of dry bones. And then the fourth one is the longest one, 9 chapters with the restored temple in Ezekiel 40 to 48. And each one of these visions like I said, gives you some point of consideration in the whole story of the Bible. I'll show you how this works as we go through this. Let's start out with the first one, though. In Ezekiel chapter 1, the book opens up with this grand vision of the likeness of the glory of God. And we know that the main figure of the Bible is not us. It's not about you. It's not about me. It's about God. And so what this vision is showing you is things that are similar to how the Bible opens up. The glory of God in Genesis chapter 1 as he speaks the world into existence. We're not going to read all of this, but I have some depictions of this. These are the best pictures of this I could find. So this at least helps you to imagine this a little bit. But Ezekiel looks up as he gets into this vision, and he sees these composite creatures that are emerging from this tumultuous storm. You can imagine all the sounds that he would have been hearing. You can imagine how frightened he may have been here. But as he looks at these composite creatures that emerge from the storm, they've got 4 different faces on them. And one of the faces is the face of the lion, the mightiest of all the animals, or the king of the jungle, which actually should be the tiger. If a tiger and a lion were to fight, the tiger would win. And the tiger is actually the one that even lives in the wilderness or the jungle anyways. The lions are more out in the open plain. I don't know why the lion is ever, whatever. But anyways, that's how we think about the lion. So you have the lion and then the ox, which is the strongest of all the domesticated animals. You've got one side of it that's like the face of a man, which has dominion over all creation. And then you've got the face of an eagle, which is like the greatest of all the birds. Now, because there's 4 different faces, these creatures don't have to pivot or turn to see things. They can just go one direction, and then they can go this direction, and then they go this direction. And because they've got a face on each side, they can see everything without having to pivot or turn. Imagine seeing that, and Ezekiel's like squinting his eyes going, what does this all mean? And as this vision gets closer and closer to him, he sees something else. He sees these giant wheels. And I've always wanted to get Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 18 like burned into or like graven onto one of my tires or my wheels, where it says, their rims were tall and awesome, and the rims were full of eyes all around. So you imagine like there's a wheel within a wheel, so like those creatures that can move any direction without having to pivot, you get this idea that these wheels can go any direction without having to turn or anything like this. So kind of very strange. As he looks up above these wheels, though, he sees something that's maybe like this, where you put all of this together, where you've got these creatures here, you've got these wheels within wheels, but above all of this is this great expanse. And the great expanse seems like some kind of a platform that a king would ride on. You remember in like old movies where kings would be carried by these people, and the king would have people like wave the big leaf and give him grapes and all these kinds of things. You got this picture of God being this cosmic king, and every time these wheels moved and the creatures moved, it sounded like many waters. Now, as Ezekiel looks even further up from this platform, he can see this figure that's on top of the platform. And it's one like a human being, that has the likeness of a human being. You'd expect it maybe to be something that has some totally different form, but it's something that has the likeness of a human being on it. Look at Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 28, the second half of the verse. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God. And when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of one speaking. Now, notice that word likeness. All throughout Ezekiel 1, it was the likeness of the 4 living creatures. It was the likeness of the faces. It was the likeness of the living creatures, the likeness of the expanse, like awe-inspired. He keeps using the word like, because you can't even get the full picture of the glory of God. This is just a dim reflection of it, but even the dim reflection of it causes Ezekiel to fall down as though he's dead. What's the first thing that we need to know in the Bible story? Is the likeness of the glory of God. And our responsibility to fall down before His glory. You've heard those omni words, omnipresence, omniscience, all those things. There's at least 3 of those that apply to this story. There's some of the attributes of God that we see in this. The first one being God's omnipotence, that He's all-powerful. Well, how do you see that in this vision? Look, if a storm ushers you in, that says something about how powerful you are. if you're on top of this great throne, on this great expanse, it says something about how powerful you are. God is being portrayed here as omnipotent, which in this time period is an interesting picture for Ezekiel to give. Because in this time period, you had different gods over different regions. And if your nation was defeated, what did everybody assume about your God? Everybody assumed that your God was defeated because we were defeated. But in this story, what you have happening is you've got the nation of Israel having been exiled, they're brought out of their homeland, and then the first thing that Ezekiel sees is God is still powerful. You're in exile right now, but it's not because God's been defeated. You think about some of the things that's happened in the last 2 years with COVID and concerns about economy and all these different things, and some people might wonder, well, what is God doing? Why is God allowing? And I don't know the answer to all of that, but we know from a vision like this that God is always all-powerful. So you see that. You also see that He's omnipresent. He can be anywhere. You see it in verse 12, where these creatures can go in any direction without having to turn. In verse 17, they've got these wheels that can take them anywhere. God is anywhere. There's nothing that you've ever done that He couldn't have been witness to, which is going to be more so the next thing with omniscience. But omnipresence is kind of the same idea. God is coming to Ezekiel in Babylon. He's not confined to Jerusalem, which is where the Israelites would have thought He must be. So He's omnipresent. But notice the next one is that He's omniscient. You've got in verse 18 the rims that had the four wheels that were full of eyes all around. God sees everything that happens. Which, by the way, this audience of Ezekiel, that was something that they needed to know. We'll see more about this in just a moment. But in Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 12, they're committing all these abominations in the temple, and they say, the Lord does not see us, the Lord has forsaken the land. And then the book opens up with saying, no, 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 God sees everything that happens. He sees everything that's happening in the temple. There's no secret deed that you've ever done that God's unaware of, which might convict you, or at the same time it could encourage you. Because if you're the kind of person doing good deeds in secret and you don't ever get credit for it, who still sees it? Notice the last attribute of God in this is you have the mercy of God. In verse 28, when he sees all of this, look at the beginning of this verse. Like the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud on the day of rain, so was the appearance of the brightness all around. The appearance of a bow was part of this vision. Where's the first time that we read about a bow, a rainbow? In Genesis, when after God sends the flood and then He sends the rainbow to say that I'm never going to judge again. Like, look at, there's a lot of religions that will have a God that's really powerful, but He's not merciful. And maybe even you think about God in that way. Or you think about God being really merciful but not very powerful. Do you see that in this vision? Both of these things are being put together. God is all these omni kinds of things, but at the same time you're reminded of His mercy by seeing the bow. Okay, so all that's really interesting. Do you see like how in Genesis chapter 1, one of the things that we debate about it, was it literal 6 days? Was it not literal 6 days? Questions that the original audience were really not concerned with. What is the message of Genesis chapter 1? If God can speak it all into existence, then He's the one that's worthy of all worship. And so in like manner, Ezekiel begins with this great vision of God that shows you, why would you worship anything else? Think about this in your life. Is there anything right now that you're putting above God? Ideologies, physical things, your status, your wealth, whatever it might be. Do you see the foolishness of putting anything like that above God? That's how the Bible opens, and that's how the book of Ezekiel opens. But notice the second vision. In Ezekiel chapters 8 through 11, if one of the messages of Ezekiel 1 would be the folly of worshiping anything other than God, the second vision shows you the folly of them worshiping something other than God. And here's an image of what the temple may have looked like at this point. What happens here is Ezekiel, who at the beginning of the book is called a priest, Ezekiel's a priest, but he's away from the temple. Well, fortunately for him, in the second vision, as a priest, he gets to go into the temple. But guess what's there? A lot of bad things. And so he's brought here in this vision. You can imagine him being like airdropped into the temple complex, and he's trying to adjust to everything. And there's this angelic figure that's showing him all of the abominations that's happening in this place where the glorious God wants to dwell. And the first abomination is at the north gate here, and it's this image of jealousy. Well, I don't know what that is. Something that incites the jealousy of God, because God is exclusively the God of the Israelites, but they're putting things above God. There's different ideas on what exactly the image was, but it was something that they shouldn't have had. Ezekiel is then brought through, he crawls through a hole in one of these walls, and he's brought into this inner chamber area. And he sees that there's all these engravings of creatures all over the walls, all of these loathsome beasts that they should never have worshipped. And he sees that there's 70 elders of the people worshiping God. This is getting pretty bad. What about the third abomination? You've got a bunch of women who are weeping somewhere around this area in the temple complex. And normally if a woman is weeping, that's something that elicits our compassion. But in this case, you've got all of these women weeping for Tammuz. And all of us just collectively sigh, oh no, not Tammuz. Because we all remember what Tammuz is. Tammuz was one of the regional rising and dying gods. That every winter the god would die, but every spring the god would come back to life. And it was one of the ways that they brought this god back to life was by weeping for him to return, because they missed him so bad. And so you got all these women weeping for Tammuz. The final one is on the east side, the east entrance, and there's 25 men worshiping the sun. Now, the sun rises in the east, and this direction, this way, would be the east. So what they're doing is they're bowing down to the sun as it's going up, is they're turning their back to God. Symbolically, and you see them doing all of these things in the place that this glorious God is supposed to dwell. You remember in Genesis 3, when man sins, it causes a separation between man and God. They're evicted from the garden. In like manner, this vision shows you, and there's a thread of thought throughout all these chapters, that because of your abomination, there's going to be a separation between you and God. Look at how this happens in this vision. In Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 6, Son of man, do you see what they are doing, the great abominations that the house of Israel are committing here, to drive me far from my sanctuary? I'm going to leave this place. Ezekiel 10:4, and the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub to the threshold of the house. So God's packing up his bags, and he's getting ready to leave. Ezekiel chapter 10, verses 18 and 19. Then the glory of the Lord went out from the threshold of the house and stood over the cherubim, and the cherubim lifted up their wings and mounted up from the earth. Or Ezekiel chapter 11, verse 23. And the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain that is on the east side of the city, which, by the way, would have been the Mount of Olives. Do you remember where Jesus was when he predicted the destruction of Jerusalem? He was up with his 4 disciples on the Mount of Olives looking down at Jerusalem, and he says that this place is going to be destroyed. And now God is vacating and going to that same place, showing that God's protection is not here anymore, and the Babylonians are going to come in the third besiegement, and they're going to wipe this place clean. What's the Bible story? God is glorious. God is all of those omni things. And we have rebelled against him. God wanted to dwell within us, but within us we've been committing all kinds of idolatries. There's things within our heart that shouldn't be there. There's things that we venerate above God. There's things that we put above God. There's sins that we harbor in our heart. All these things that causes God to go, okay, I'm packing up my bags and I'm leaving. And now you're going to be removed from the only thing that could ever bring you real blessings. But do you remember in Ezekiel chapter 1 that God is also merciful? The third vision, go over to Ezekiel 37. We're going to read from this one. In Ezekiel 37, you've got this famous story of the valley of dry bones. which is a vivid depiction of what idolatry leaves people, what state idolatry leaves people in. You're just a valley of dry bones, and you've got no hope. But look what God does to these people who have committed idolatry. Look at Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 1 through 6. The hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me out in the spirit of the Lord, and set me down in the middle of the valley. It was full of bones. And he led me around among them, and behold, there were very many on the surface of the valley, and behold, they were very dry. And he said to me, Son of man, can these bones live? And I answered, O Lord God, you know. Then he said to me, Prophesy over these bones, and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God to these bones, Behold, I will cause breath or spirit to enter you, and you shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you, and cause flesh to come upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord. All right. Try to imagine being Ezekiel here. You're transported for the third time, and like every time, and you go back to the people of Israel, and you try to explain what this vision is, like, okay, well, what's it going to be this time? You're brought into this valley. And there, you can imagine like mountains on either side. And in this valley, there's all these many human bones. Pretty eerie, scary kind of thing to imagine. And he started to walk around among them. You imagine him kind of like tiptoeing and making sure. And these bones are so dry that I would imagine it would sound like a Cheeto if you stepped on one of them. Sorry for that imagery. But if you stepped on it, like these bones would have just like crunched and like dissipated or something. They're very, very dead. All these femur bones and hip bones and toe bones and all these different things. And suddenly, God breaks the silence of the moment, and he says to him, Son of man, can these bones live? If you're Ezekiel and God asks you that question, what's your response to God? I could tell you what my response would be. Okay, Eric, can these bones live? And I go, no. Like, you already know that. Like, look at, that one just sounded like a Cheeto. That femur was like a big Cheeto. And I stepped on it. Didn't you hear that, God? That's my answer to that question, but Ezekiel answers a very different kind of way. And he says, Oh Lord God, you know. Only you know, God, if you can bring these bones back to life, even though decomposition has already happened. I wonder if Ezekiel's thinking, okay, I remember back to those times of Elijah and Elisha, and they had raised some people from the dead. But I mean, those people still had like their skin and their flesh and stuff like that, but maybe God could do something here. And so God tells Ezekiel that you start speaking and you say, Oh, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Can you imagine somebody like maybe... it sounds like something that like a crazy person would do. You're walking along and you see an alleyway and there's this person talking to a bunch of dead rats. And he's like, oh, dead rats, hear what I have to say. Like, you're crazy. Can you imagine somebody literally speaking to a bunch of dead bones all by himself in the wilderness? Well, I guess sometimes the things that God asks us to do would make us look crazy. But Ezekiel speaks. And as he speaks, these bones like come back together. You can imagine them like dragging in the sand, and they're like getting magnetically connected back together, and then they're getting assembled, and all the sinew and the flesh and the muscle, everything comes back. And it's because Ezekiel kept speaking the Spirit to them that they had this kind of resurrection. What is this showing? Maybe this shows, first of all, the picture of our spiritual state. That you've got this glorious God that you've defected from, that he wanted to dwell within you, but you harbored all kinds of things, so he vacated, and what you were left with was this spiritual state. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1, I'm reminded of this. And you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world. Notice that he does not say you were hobbling in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked. He doesn't say you were crippled in the trespasses in which you once walked. He doesn't say that you were like making some mistakes and kind of making it, but really needed just a minor tune-up is really what you need. You were dead. You had no hope. There was nothing that you could have done on your own that would have ever caused you to be saved. How do you think of yourself prior to your salvation? Well, you know, I grew up in a pretty good family, and Daddy was an elder, and great-granddaddy was an elder, and going back, I think, like a million years, they were all elders and preachers. And I'm pretty sure that when I needed to be baptized, that God was probably pretty excited to finally have me on his team because he knew that I was going to bring some abilities and gifts that without me, the kingdom may have fallen apart. What's your perspective on who you were before you were converted? Do you see that you were like those Cheeto bones that had no hope, and that God needed to come and speak life-giving words to you because of your idolatry? So it's not just a picture of our spiritual state, but throughout this text in Ezekiel 37, several times, Ezekiel is called Son of Man, Son of Man, Son of Man. Is there anybody else that comes later in the Bible that's also known as Son of Man, that brought words that gave life to people that were spiritually dead? It rhymes with Mesus, and his name is Jesus. John 6:63. It is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh is no help at all. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. So think about the Bible story so far, as Ezekiel is showing it. The glory of God, the idolatry of man to not recognize the glory of God. Your dead state because of it. But in God's good mercy and God's good grace, he sent the Son of Man that brought words that gave life to everybody, which was the whole world, filled with these bones in the valley of death. And because of those words, he's bringing people back to life. And in the Ezekiel 37 passage, it ends with them becoming this great army that fights for the Lord. I understand that the Bible teaches that our response to what God has given is that we have to respond with obedience and we have to respond with faith, and that we do have a part in all of this. But let me just say it this way. If Jesus had never come, well, let me say it this way first. If Ezekiel had never come to that valley, would those bones have ever been resurrected? Those bones would have had no hope. If Jesus would have never come to this world, would you ever have hope? No. So you respond to what he's done in faith, but if Jesus didn't first take the step to come here, in our idolatry, we would have been eternally separated from God. Notice the fourth vision. Go to Ezekiel chapter 47. This is a very long vision, and there's different parts of it that are very climactic. And I want to show you, I think, in my judgment, which is maybe the most climactic part of the whole vision. But throughout this vision, it's this restored temple. So if the second vision showed you the temple filled with idolatry, the fourth vision shows you the temple of God filled with everything that it was supposed to have all the time. But it's this grand, huge vision of this temple, which is not something that we're literally waiting to be fulfilled, but I think it's a picture of what we have in this age, and it's also a picture of what we're expecting in the age to come. Look at Ezekiel 47, though. After Ezekiel has walked the premises and he's seen all the rooms that the priests are going to serve in, all these things, look at Ezekiel 47 and notice what starts happening at the temple. Ezekiel 47, verses 1 through 3. Then he brought me back to the door of the temple, and behold, water was issuing from below the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced east. The water was flowing down from below the south end of the threshold of the temple, south of the altar. Then he brought me out by way of the north gate, and led me around on the outside to the outer gate that faces toward the east, and behold, the water was trickling out on the south side. Going on eastward with a measuring line in his hand, the man measured 1,000 cubits and then led me through the water, and it was ankle deep. I'm just going to stop there. But you guys probably remember, like 6 years ago, I showed you this same picture, and here it is again. So I probably don't need to say a lot about it because you saw it 6 years ago. But this vision, Ezekiel sees this grand, glorious temple, and he sees this water coming from this threshold here. And then he exits by the north gate and walks all the way around here and comes over here, and he sees, well, this little trickle has gotten a little bit bigger. And then he goes a third of a mile, a third of a mile, a third of a mile. Where would he end? Over by Tom? He's over there now. That's where he would end up. And he eventually goes to this sea, the Dead Sea. And he sees that at the Dead Sea, this trickle that started out very, very small has now brought life to the Dead Sea. Can you imagine the Salton Sea? When I was flying in, I looked out the plane, I go, oh yeah, the Salton Sea. I remember going to that place a couple times with those fish bones there. That would have been also like Cheetos, I bet. I wonder how many times I can bring up Cheetos in this meeting this week. I've got, I think, 3 now. Can you imagine the Salton Sea going back to the way it used to be in the 40s or 50s? Back when people would have hotels there and people would vacation there? The Dead Sea. That does nothing but take and take and take and take and take from the Jordan River, but never gives anything to anybody because of how polluted it is. By the way, are you that kind of person? Where you just take and take and take, like a Dementor in Harry Potter? Just keep taking, and you never have an ounce of anything to give anybody. How could anything like that ever be transformed? Well, there's this stream that comes from the presence of God. That when they really grasp hold of this stream, it transforms things. I think this vision shows us something about the mission that God has left us in the story of the Bible. Notice that at the beginning and end of this vision, this trickle of water is coming from the temple. Where does God dwell? In the temple. In this temple he'll dwell, not at the one in the second vision. But God dwells in this temple, and from the presence of God comes this stream of water that gives life to things that never could have had life before. So, do you live and think and are motivated as if you really believe all the blessings that you most deeply need are found in Jesus? What are the things that you go to for blessing? To alleviate your conscience, to find meaning in life, to have a sense of identity, to have a sense of hope. What are the things that you go to? Is it the news? Politics? Does your life reflect that you really believe that blessings come from Jesus? So maybe it says something in that way, but what else does the Bible say is the temple of God? So it's Jesus, right? But then it also says that you are. In 1 Corinthians 3, verse 16, do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? By the way, have you ever noticed in 1 Corinthians that the audience of 1 Corinthians prided themselves in this higher knowledge and they were very sophisticated and smart? Have you ever noticed how many times Paul says to that audience, do you not know? Do you not know? Do you not know? Do you not know? Like a bunch of times he says that to them. And one of the things that they were forgetting is that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells within you. So going back to this vision, we see Jesus in this, right? The blessings flow from Jesus and they flow towards things that are dead like us, and they give us life and they rejuvenate us. But do you see yourself as the temple too? That from you, what's supposed to flow is life-giving water. You think about all the people in this world that have detached from the glorious God, and they're committing idolatry. What is it that's going to help them know the right thing except the temples that God has left throughout the whole world that have the stream of God's love and mercy that we've learned, and we're sharing it with other people, and it transforms their life? Do you embrace that as your purpose in life? Or is your purpose in life a myriad of other things that the classic kind of things that we could list out? Politics, wealth, status, whatever it could be. Do you live as if your mission is that the world around me is filled with people who are spiritually dead? And I've got this knowledge, this stream of living water that can flow from me with the things that I've grown up learning or I've learned since I become a Christian, and I have words that can literally give people hope who don't have hope. So it says something about our mission, but I think it also says something about what we anticipate even in the future. The final verse of the book of Ezekiel, anybody know what it says? Hey, Lito, good to see you. The final verse of the book of Ezekiel, the Lord is there. The Lord is there. This great, glorious temple that gets perfected ends with this idea that this is the place where God dwells. And this glorious God from Ezekiel chapter 1 is getting reunited with people that had detached from Him. Do we have a down payment of that? I think we got a down payment of that, where like God is with us now, right? But is there a sense in which we're going to have that more fully one day? In the book of Revelation, at the end of the book, it talks about the bride of Christ, and it has all these beautiful descriptions of the bride of Christ. And it says this in Revelation 21, verse 3, "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God.'" As it's describing this new dwelling place of God at the end of the book of Revelation, which I think we get a taste of, but we don't have the full fulfillment of yet. It shows that God will fully one day be dwelling back with us. It's not like Ezekiel where he sees the likeness of the glory of God. We get to be with God, and we're going to be transformed in 1 John chapter 3. We're going to be transformed in such a way that we can see God as he really is. The great, glorious God that every time we see a beautiful sunset, every time you go to the beach and see the wonders of his creation, you get a dim sense of how great he is by the things he's made. You get to be with the one that created all of that fully, and he doesn't have to hide any of his glory like he did with Moses when he was in the cleft of the rock, or like he did with Elijah when he was on the same mountain, and God just shows him part of his glory when he passes by. You get to be in the full presence of God forever. You who had abominations in your temple can be forgiven and restored and made ultimately perfected, where there'll be no temptation to sin. Do you see how the four visions of Ezekiel show the whole story of the Bible? The glorious God that we've detached from, that he in his mercy has sent the Son of Man to give us life so that we would have a new mission in life and that we could ultimately be with him forever one day. Everything that we're going to talk about in this meeting is framed by the whole story of the Bible. That's what every sermon should be. That's what every Bible class should be. And I just thought it would be helpful for us as we begin this series of lessons to remind ourselves of the big picture of the Bible from maybe an angle you hadn't thought about before, from the book of Ezekiel. So I appreciate the time that we've already had together, and I'm looking forward to the time that we're going to spend together for the rest of this week. And that's the 2-minute bell, right? Is it 3? It's a 5-minute bell? I forgot that. Okay. Well, do you guys have any thoughts or comments or anything from any of this? Or do you just want to chat for an extra 5 minutes? All right, meeting adjourned.
I'm not sure how to turn that off. I guess I have to turn off the projector, right? Well, if you want people looking at, is it okay to let people look to see what we're doing?
Oh, I think, yeah.
Okay.